There is a place in the Blue Ridge Mountains where the old Cherokee would not walk after the sun went down, not because of the bears, not because of the cold that pours off the high ridges once the light fades and settles into the hollows like water. They avoided it because of the sound, a low, steady drumming that seemed to rise out of the rock itself, muffled, patient, coming from somewhere deep inside the stone, as if there were a room in there, and people in that room, and those people were keeping time to a music that no one on the outside was ever meant to hear. The Cherokee had a name for the ones who made that sound. They called them the Unwi-tsunsdi, the Little People. And when a young ethnographer named James Mooney came into these mountains in the late 1880s, a notebook in his hand and a government salary in his pocket, sent to write down everything the Cherokee still remembered before the last of the old men died and took it with them, the Little People were one of the first things those old men wanted to talk about. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Not as a bedtime story, not as a fairy tale for children. They spoke about them the way you would speak about a neighbor you respected, a neighbor you feared a little, a neighbor who had been living in these hills long before any Cherokee had ever set foot on them. And that is the detail that almost everyone misses. The Cherokee did not claim the Little People as their ancestors. They did not say, "These are the spirits of our grandfathers." They said the Little People were already here, already old, already settled into the rock ledges and the laurel thickets and the deep places under the mounds when the Cherokee themselves were still new to this land. When the old men described them, they were describing something they had inherited the country from, not something they had dreamed up around a fire. Mooney wrote it down. He filed it into a thick government report with a plain grey cover, and the world moved on and forgot about it. But if you actually read what he recorded, and you sit with it long enough, a strange and uncomfortable question begins to take shape. What if those old men were not telling him a myth at all? What if they were telling him history, the oldest history there is? A history so old that it does not fit inside the story we have all been handed about who built what, and when, and who was here first. A history that someone, somewhere, at some point, decided we would all be better off forgetting. Imagine you are up there yourself. It is the tail end of the day in the high country of western North Carolina, and the light is going out of the sky the way it does in these mountains, not gradually but all at once, as the sun drops behind a ridge, and the whole valley falls into shadow while the peaks above you still burn. The temperature drops with it. The fog begins to gather in the low places and climb. The rhododendron closes in around the trail, dense and dark and taller than a man, until you are walking through a green tunnel that lets in almost no light. And somewhere ahead of you, or below you, or inside the mountain to your left, you hear it. A sound with a rhythm to it, steady, deliberate. Not the wind, because the wind has no pattern, and not water, because water does not keep time. A drum, faint and muffled, and unmistakably coming from inside the rock. Now ask yourself what you would do. You are miles from anyone. The light is nearly gone, and you have just heard, coming out of solid stone, the sound of a gathering you cannot see and cannot reach. Every instinct the Cherokee built up over centuries in this country says the same thing. Do not go looking, do not follow the sound. Turn around, walk home, and say nothing. That instinct did not come from nowhere. It was the distilled experience of 100 generations who had learned, the hard way, what happens to the people who go looking for the drum. Mooney heard that instinct in the voices of the old men. He felt it in the care with which they spoke, the way they lowered their voices, the way they made sure he understood that this was not a game. And whatever you believe about what was actually inside those mountains, you cannot honestly read his account and conclude that the men telling it did not believe every word. That belief is the raw material of this entire investigation. Belief that specific, that consistent, that carefully guarded, held by sober and unsentimental people across an enormous span of time, does not usually attach itself to nothing. It attaches to something. The only real question is what, and the official answer, That it attached to a charming fantasy the Cherokee invented to explain the dark is by far the least interesting possibility, and, when you look closely at how specific and how corroborated and how place-anchored the accounts actually are, by no means obviously the correct one. To understand why that question matters, you first have to understand the man who was sitting across from those old men, writing everything down. Because James Mooney was not a treasure hunter. He was not a mystic. He was, by every account, one of the most careful and honest recorders of native memory that America ever produced, and the things he wrote down were not the things he expected to find. Mooney was born in 1861 inches, Richmond, Indiana, the son of poor Irish immigrants. He never went to a fine university. He was, in the truest sense, self-taught. A man who read everything he could get his hands on, and who developed an obsession, early and total, with the native peoples of the continent he had been born into. As a young man, he simply wrote to the Bureau of Ethnology in Washington and more or less talked his way into a job. By the mid-1880s, he was working under John Wesley Powell, the one-armed Civil War veteran who ran the Bureau and who believed, correctly, that an entire world of knowledge was vanishing faster than anyone could record it. Because that was the situation, the 1880s were the last window. The generation of Cherokee who still carried the full body of the old knowledge, the sacred formulas, the plant medicine, the star law, the accounts of the ones who came before, were old men in the 1880s. In a few more years they would be gone. And with the removal of the 1830s, the Trail of Tears, still a living memory in the minds of the people Mooney was talking to, there was every reason to believe the knowledge would die with them and never be recovered. Powell knew it. Mooney knew it. So Mooney went into the mountains of western North Carolina, to the Qualla boundary, where a stubborn remnant of the Cherokee had refused to be removed and had clung to the high country, and he began to listen. What he found there was not a broken people repeating half-remembered fragments. What he found was a living library. And the chief librarian, the man who would become Mooney's single most important source, was a medicine man named Swimmer. In Cherokee his name was Ayunini. He was a keeper of the old ways, in the most literal sense. He carried in his head the sacred formulas, the myths, the songs, the histories, and he even kept a manuscript book written in the Cherokee syllabary that Sequoyah had invented earlier in the century, in which some of the formulas were recorded in his own hand. Swimmer was not a curiosity. He was a scholar of a tradition that had no written canon and needed none, because men like him were the canon. And it was Swimmer, and men like him, John Axe and Sueta and the others, who told Mooney about the little people, slowly, carefully, with a seriousness that unsettled the young man from Indiana. Because these were not people who told stories for entertainment. When Swimmer spoke about the Yunwitsunsti, he was not spinning a yarn. He was passing on information, and the information was specific, uncomfortably specific. The land they were sitting in matters here too. The Southern Appalachians are among the oldest mountains on the surface of the earth. Older than the Rockies, older than the Alps, older, by hundreds of millions of years, than the Himalayas. These are the worn-down roots of a range that once stood as tall as anything on the planet, ground down by a span of time the human mind cannot really hold. To stand in a laurel thicket in the Smokies at dusk, with the fog moving through the trees and the light going blue and the drip of water off every leaf, is to stand in a place that feels genuinely ancient in a way that is hard to put into words. The Cherokee felt it. They built their whole cosmology around it, and they insisted, again and again, that they were not the first tenants. The Cherokee sense of how old the world was did not match the tidy, shallow chronology that the newcomers carried with them. In the account brought over from Europe, the whole of human history could be counted in a few thousand years, the world itself only a little older, everything neat and recent and accounted for. The Cherokee account had no such bottom to it. They spoke of ages before ages. They spoke of a time when the earth was soft and new, and the animals and the first people were still sorting out the rules of the world. They spoke of monsters that had once ruled the land and been cleared away, of the Uktena, the great horned serpent, and of other beings that belonged to an older order of things that had passed. Their past went down and down, into a depth of time that the shortened history simply refused to allow, and into that depth they placed the older builders, the hidden nations, the ones who came before, not a few centuries back, not a tidy textbook amount of time, but far down, in an antiquity that the official story had no room for and therefore quietly erased. So, who were the little people, according to the men who actually knew? Mooney recorded that the Unwitsundsdi were a race of small beings, no taller than a child's knee, perfectly formed, with long hair that in some accounts fell all the way to the ground. They lived in the mountains, in caves among the rocks, in the cliffs, in the deep places under the laurel. They loved music above almost everything, drums most of all. Much of the drumming that people heard coming out of the rock ledges, that low, patient rhythm in the stone, was said to be theirs. They were, for the most part, helpful, especially to children. There were accounts of lost children who wandered into the mountains and should have died of cold and hunger, and were instead found days later, warm, fed, cared for, and who spoke of small people who had looked after them and then sent them home. But they were not tame, and they were not to be intruded upon. This is where the accounts turned sharp. Mooney recorded that the little people did not want to be followed. If you heard their drum and went looking for it, you would never find them, and worse, you might lose your own way and your own mind in the search. If you saw one, there were rules. In many accounts you were forbidden to speak of the encounter for a set span of time, often given as 7 years, and if you broke that silence, you would die. The little people helped, but they helped on their terms, and their terms were absolute. They valued their privacy the way a hidden people values it, the way a people who do not want to be found values it. Mooney recorded that there were different kinds. The old men distinguished between them the way you would distinguish between different families, or different towns, or different tribes. There were the laurel people, playful and mischievous, the ones who made you slip on the wet rocks and laugh at you for it, whose humour could turn cruel. There were the rock people, and these were the ones to be careful of. They lived in the caves, in the true rock, and they were ill-tempered and vengeful, and the old men said it was because their homes had been intruded upon so many times over the years. They were the ones associated with stolen children, with people led astray, with the darker edge of the whole tradition. And there were the dogwood people, who were said to be good and steady and kind, who lived in the woods and looked after people quietly and asked nothing in return. Sit with that for a moment, because that is not how myths usually work. A myth tends to flatten. A myth gives you the spirit of the forest, singular, an idea. But this is not an idea. This is a taxonomy. This is the way you describe real populations that you have observed over a long span of time and learned to tell apart by where they live and how they behave. Cherokee were not describing a symbol. They were describing, or at least they believed they were describing, distinct groups of an actual people. A people with territories, a people with temperaments, a people with a history of grievance against the newcomers who kept blundering into their homes. And their homes, again and again, were the rock ledges, the stone, the caves and the cliffs and the deep places under the mountains. This is the thread that runs through all of it, and it is the thread that turns a folklore study into something stranger. The Cherokee did not say the little people lived in the trees, or in the rivers, or in the sky. They said they lived inside the rock, that there were rooms in there, townhouses, the same word the Cherokee used for their own great council houses, built inside the mountains, where the little people gathered and kept their fires and beat their drums. Travellers spoke of passing a certain cliff and hearing, from inside the solid stone, the unmistakable sound of a crowd, voices, laughter, the stamp of dancing feet, the drum, and then coming back the next day in the daylight and finding nothing but a blank rock face and no way in. Mooney collected the specific encounters, and it is worth slowing down on a few of them, because the specificity is the whole point. There was the account of the man who was out in the woods and heard the little people at work, and crept close, and saw them, small and busy, and how they were not frightened of him, but simply asked him, firmly, to go home and to say nothing, and reminded him of what would happen if he did. There were the accounts of hunters who left food out and found it taken, and found in return small kindnesses done, game driven toward them, lost trails made clear. There was the recurring detail of the little people and cane, and reed, the way they were tied to the making of things, to craft, to a competence that ordinary people respected and did not match. and running underneath all of it was a code of conduct, a set of rules for coexistence that the Cherokee had clearly worked out over a very long time. Do not follow them. Do not take what is theirs. Do not boast of having seen them. Do not intrude on the rock ledges without cause. Leave them their privacy, and they will leave you your luck, and even help you, but violate the terms and the help becomes something else. That is not how a people relates to a superstition. That is how a people relates to a neighbor, a powerful and secretive neighbor whose territory overlaps your own and whose patience has limits. The Cherokee were not worshipping the little people. They were managing a relationship with them. And you do not manage a relationship with a thing that is not there. Now, hold on to the idea of townhouses inside the mountains, because it connects to the second great thread in what Mooney recorded, and it is even harder to explain away. Because the little people were not the only hidden nation the Cherokee described. There was another, older, in some tellings, greater. The Cherokee called them the Nunahi. The name Nunahi is usually translated as the people who live anywhere, or the travelers, or simply the immortals. And that word, immortals, is not a decoration. The Cherokee meant it. The Nunahi did not die. They were a spirit people, human in form, invisible when they chose to be, and solid and present when they chose to appear, and they had lived in these mountains from the beginning and would live there until the end. Where the little people were knee-high and hidden in the rocks, the Nunahi were full-sized, indistinguishable from ordinary Cherokee at a glance, and they too had their townhouses in the high places, under the tallest peaks, beneath the bald mountains where no trees grow, under the water of the deep rivers and lakes, and, most significantly of all, beneath the great mounds. Mooney recorded the specific places. The Nunahi had a townhouse under Pilot Knob. They had one under Blood Mountain in Georgia. They had one beneath the old mound at Niquosi, where the town of Franklin, North Carolina now stands, a mound that is still there today, that you can drive past and see, a grassy hill rising out of a suburban intersection with a stubbornness that feels almost defiant. And the Cherokee said that inside that mound, and inside the mountains, lived an immortal people who occasionally, on certain nights, could be heard holding their dances, and who now and then invited a living Cherokee inside to join them, into a great warm townhouse, full of light and music that existed, somehow, inside a hill of earth and inside a wall of stone. There is a story Mooney recorded about the Nunahi and the Niquosi mound that is worth telling in full, because it is not the kind of story you invent for children. Long ago, the account goes, an enemy army came down on the Cherokee town at Niquosi, and the people knew they could not win. As the attackers closed in, a stranger appeared, a Cherokee-looking man who was not from the town, and he told the people to stay in their houses and not be afraid. And then from the mound itself poured out a host of warriors, the Nunahi, the immortals, invisible one moment and terrible the next, and they fell on the invading army and destroyed it. And when it was over, they withdrew back into the mound, and the hill closed behind them, and the town was saved. The Cherokee did not tell this story as a metaphor. They told it as an account of something that happened at a place you can still visit, involving a people who lived, and the old men believed, still lived, inside the earth. So now we have two hidden nations, a small people in the rock ledges and the caves, and an immortal people inside the mountains and beneath the mounds. And here is where the whole thing starts to strain against the boundaries of what we are comfortable calling folklore. Because there is a third piece, and the third piece is the one that the revisionist historians, the ones who look at the record and refuse to accept the shortened, sanitized version of the human past, keep coming back to. The Cherokee said that the mounds were not theirs. Think about what that means. The southeastern United States is covered in earthworks, thousands of them. Enormous mounds, some of them rising dozens of feet, requiring the movement of hundreds of thousands of cubic feet of earth, laid out with clear geometric intent, aligned in ways that track the movements of the sun. Cahokia, in Illinois, at its height was larger than London was at the same time. The mound builders raise structures on a scale that stuns modern engineers who bother to actually measure them. And the standard story, the one in the textbooks, is that these were built by the ancestors of the native peoples who were living there when Europeans arrived. There is a piece of hard, documented history that sits uneasily against the textbook timeline, and it comes from the first Europeans to walk through this country. In 1540, the Spanish expedition of Hernando de Soto cut a long, brutal path through the southeast, and the men who kept its chronicles wrote down what they saw. They described a land that was not empty and was not primitive. They described large towns, populous and organized, ruled from atop great earthen mounds, with granaries and plazas and roads between them. They described a civilization in full operation, but they also described something stranger, tucked into the accounts almost as an aside. They passed through regions where the mounds and the towns were already old, already abandoned, where the great works stood grass-grown and empty, and the people living nearby did not fully know who had raised them. By the time the next wave of Europeans came through, more than a century later, even the living civilization De Soto had described was largely gone, swept away by the diseases his expedition and others had carried inland, leaving behind the mounds and the memory and the survivors who would eventually become the tribes the English and the French would meet. So the record already contains one collapse we can document, one great forgetting, one civilization reduced to earthworks and stories within living memory. And if that happened once, in the daylight of written history, in a span of decades, then the revisionist question sharpens into something you cannot easily wave away. If one advanced world in this land could fall and be half forgotten that quickly, why not another, older one before it? Why not the one the Cherokee kept insisting had been here first? But that is not always what the native peoples themselves said. Mooney recorded that the Cherokee, when asked who built the old mounds, did not always claim them. In some accounts they said the mounds had been built by a people who came before. In others, they attributed them to the Nunnehi, the immortals, the ones who lived inside them still. They told Mooney that the mounds already stood, ancient and grass-grown, when the Cherokee first came into the country, that they had inherited them, not raised them, that the true builders were an older people, a vanished people, or a hidden people who had gone into the earth and pulled the door shut behind them. And there is a specific memory here. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. One that Mooney and the naturalists before him both recorded, that goes even further than the mounds. Because the Cherokee did not only speak of hidden nations that were still present, they spoke, plainly, of a people they had physically driven out. The old men called them the moon-eyed people. They were described as small, pale-skinned, with light eyes and beards, a people who could see in the dark far better than in the daylight, which is why the Cherokee gave them that name, the moon-eyed, because they moved by night and were half blinded by the sun. And the Cherokee said that when their own ancestors first came into this country, the moon-eyed people were already here, already established, already building in stone, and that the Cherokee, or a people before the Cherokee, made war on them and drove them out of the mountains, westward, into the dark, and that they went. This was not a story Mooney conjured. It had been written down long before him, by a Revolutionary-era observer who heard it directly from the Cherokee, who spoke of a white, moon-eyed people the Cherokee had expelled from the land. Two separate generations of outsiders, decades apart, heard the same account from the same people. A small, pale, night-seeing race of builders, here before us, driven into the west. And when you go looking for what the moon-eyed people might have left behind, you arrive at one of the genuine, unexplained anomalies of the Southern Mountains, a place called Fort Mountain. On the top of Fort Mountain in northern Georgia there is a wall. It is a real wall, made of stacked stone, running for hundreds of feet along the crest of the mountain, in places nearly waist high, with what appear to be pits and gateways built into it. No one knows who built it. No one knows when. It matches no known style of Cherokee construction. It served no obvious purpose that anyone has been able to reconstruct, being neither a practical fortification against any known enemy, nor an enclosure for any known settlement. It simply sits there, on top of a mountain, ancient and deliberate and unclaimed, and the oldest local explanation for it, the Cherokee explanation, is that it was built by the moon-eyed people, the pale builders, the ones who were here first and were driven into the dark, now sit with the whole shape of it. A pale, small, night-adapted people, master builders in stone, present before the current inhabitants, driven out or withdrawn, leaving behind unexplained stonework on mountain tops and, if you believe the deeper accounts, rooms inside the rock. That is not a vague myth. That is a specific, corroborated, place-anchored memory of an earlier people and their works, told by the very people who displaced them, and it is exactly the kind of memory that the shortened, official history has no comfortable place to put. So it does what it always does with such things. It calls them legend, prints them small, and moves on. And the stonework does not stop at Fort Mountain. Scattered across the eastern half of the continent, from the Georgia mountains up through the Carolinas and into New England, there are stone structures that do not fit the accepted story of who was here and what they built. There are chambers of dry-laid stone, roofed with slabs weighing many tons, built into hillsides, aligned in some cases to the rising sun on the solstice. There are long stone walls in places no farm ever stood, standing rows and cairns and enclosures that the official history assigns, with a shrug, to colonial farmers clearing fields, even where no field was ever cleared and no farmer ever lived. The people who actually study these structures in the field, and measure them, and note their alignments, keep running into the same wall the Cherokee accounts run into. The works are real, the works are old, the works are skilled, and the accepted history has no builder to offer for them, except a vague, deflecting answer designed to close the question rather than answer it. The native peoples of those regions, when they were asked, often said the same thing the Cherokee said: "We did not build these. They were here before us." They belong to an older people, a people who came first. It is the same testimony, from a different range of mountains, about the same shape of a vanished builder, and it is handled the same way. Measured quietly by a few, dismissed loudly by the many, and kept out of the story that gets taught, because it does not fit, and because the people whose ancestors actually remembered are exactly the people whose word the official history was built to discount. And this is the point where a careful listener stops and asks the question that the textbooks do not want asked. If the people living on top of the mounds said they did not build them, and said an older, greater, vanished people did, then why are we so certain we know who built them? Why is the official story so confident about a past that the people who were actually there describe very differently? This is the door that the revisionist thinkers walk through. And on the other side of it is a much larger idea, one that has grown in the last decade into a full alternative model of history. The idea has picked up the name Tartaria, borrowed from the old maps that showed a vast, ill-defined empire sprawling across the interior of Asia, an empire that appears on charts for centuries and then quietly vanishes from the record, its name scrubbed, its territory carved up and reassigned, as if a whole civilization had been not just defeated but deliberately erased. And the Tartaria thesis, in its broadest form, says this: that the history we have been handed is not the history that happened, that there was, not so very long ago, an older and more advanced civilization spread across the whole earth, that it was struck down, by war, or by catastrophe, or by both, in an event that the survivors remembered as a kind of ending of the world, and that the record of it was buried, sometimes literally, under mud and earth, and sometimes deliberately, under a rewritten story that shortened the human past and put the newcomers, the current owners of the world, at the center of it. Now, you can dismiss that, many people do, but before you do, look again at what Mooney wrote down, without ever having heard the word Tartaria, decades before anyone framed the idea. He recorded a people, the Cherokee, who said they were not the first here, who said an older, greater people had built the great structures on the land, who said that older people had gone into the mountains and under the mounds and into the rock, into townhouses inside the stone, and could still, on certain nights, be heard. Who described the hidden ones not as gods, not as abstractions, but as populations, with territories and temperaments and grievances, and who guarded the knowledge of these things so carefully that they imposed a death sentence on anyone who spoke of an encounter too soon. Does that sound like a fairy tale? Or does it sound like the fractured, carefully preserved memory of a real transition from one world to another, kept alive by a people who had inherited a haunted country and knew exactly whose country it had been? The little people motif is the part that stops the revisionist researchers cold, because it is not a Cherokee peculiarity, it is everywhere. Turn to almost any culture on almost any continent and you find it. The Irish have their AOC, the people of the mounds, who live inside the hollow hills, and who must not be offended, and who steal into the human world and back out again. And notice that word again, the mounds. The Irish little people live inside the ancient earthworks that dot Ireland, structures that predate written history, and the Irish said the same thing the Cherokee said, that an older people built them, that those people withdrew into them, that they are still in there. The Scandinavians have their holder folk, the hidden people, living in the rocks, invisible, easily angered, who must be respected when you build near their stones. Iceland still, to this day, routes roads around certain boulders out of deference to them. The Hawaiians have the Menehune, a small people who were on the islands before the Polynesians arrived, who built stone structures overnight, walls and fish ponds and temples, works of stone that the later arrivals found already standing and could not fully explain. The same story. A small, older people, master builders in stone, already here, withdrawn now, into the rock, into the forest, into the hidden places. How does a people in the Appalachians, a people in Ireland, a people in Iceland, and a people in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, separated by oceans they could not cross and by every barrier of language and time, arrive at the same detailed account? A small ancient race, builders in stone, present before the current inhabitants, guardians of hidden places inside the earth, dangerous to disturb, slowly withdrawing from a world that had become too crowded with newcomers. The comfortable answer is that human beings everywhere invent the same stories because human minds work the same way, and there is real truth in that. But the revisionist thinker pushes back with a harder question. What if the reason the story is the same everywhere is that the thing being remembered was the same everywhere? What if these are not independent inventions but scattered, surviving fragments of a single lost chapter of the human story, a chapter about an older civilization, and about what happened to the people of that civilization when the world changed and their time ended? And this is where the strand that the harder revisionists care about, the one about economics and power and control, comes into it, because a shortened history is a useful thing to own. Consider what it means to control the story of the past. If the accepted history says that civilization is young, that the great works of stone were all raised by known hands in known centuries, that there was never a prior, greater world, then the current order of things looks natural, permanent, inevitable. The people in charge have always, more or less, been in charge, and the way things are is the way things have always been trending. There is nothing behind us but a slow climb up from the caves to the present, and the present is the top. But if the true history says something else, if it says there was a great and advanced world before this one, a world that was struck down and buried and written out of the record, then everything shifts. Then the current order is not the top of a long climb. It is the aftermath of a fall. It is the world that got built on the ruins, by the people who inherited the ruins, and who had every reason to make sure the previous owners were forgotten. Then the mounds are not a curiosity, they are evidence. Then the hidden people are not a superstition. They are witnesses, or the memory of witnesses, kept alive by the one group with no incentive to lie about it, the conquered and displaced natives who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and who simply told the truth as their grandfathers had told it to them. Whoever controls the story of the past controls the sense of what is possible in the present. That is the quiet economic argument underneath all of this. A civilization that believes it is the peak of all history behaves very differently from a civilization that knows it is living in the ruins of something greater. The first is complacent and easy to rule. The second asks dangerous questions. And so the argument goes, there has always been an interest, among those who benefit from the current arrangement, in keeping the past small, in keeping the mounds unexplained but unthreatening, in filing the Cherokee accounts of the hidden nations under folklore, printing them in a grey government report, and letting them gather dust where no one would think to look for a challenge to the official story of the world. It is worth being precise about what the harder version of this argument actually claims, because it is not simply that people forgot. Forgetting happens on its own. This is a claim about something more deliberate. It is a claim about the standardization of the past, about a period, roughly a century and a half ago, when a single official version of history was assembled, printed, funded, and installed in every school and museum and government report at once, and every account that did not fit was quietly demoted from history to folklore, from testimony to superstition, from evidence to entertainment. The great institutions that fixed the timeline, the ones that decided how old the world was allowed to be and who was allowed to have built what, were built in the same decades, funded by the same fortunes, staffed by men who shared the same interest in a past that was short, orderly, and flattering to the people currently in charge. And under that interest sits the oldest form of wealth there is, which is not gold and is not land. It is the control of what people believe is possible. A people who believe they stand at the summit of all history will accept their place in the world as natural. A people who suspect they are living in the wreckage of something greater, something that was taken from them and hidden, become restless and curious and hard to govern. The shortened past is not an accident of sloppy record-keeping. In this reading, it is a managed asset, maintained on purpose, because the alternative, a past with a fallen golden age in it and a question mark over who really owns the ruins, is far more expensive to allow. And the cheapest way to maintain that asset is exactly the way the Cherokee accounts were handled. You do not have to burn a dangerous account. You only have to file it under the heading of myth. Nobody looks for the truth in the fairy tale section. There is one more layer to the revisionist reading, and it is the layer that gives this whole tradition its edge as economic history rather than merely as folklore. Because the older world the Cherokee described was not only a builder of mounds and walls, it was, in the accounts, an order, a functioning society with its own wealth, its own craft, its own competence, its own way of organizing the land. The Nunahi were not scattered hermits. They lived in townhouses, in gathered communities, with dances and councils and a social life that mirrored, in the telling, an entire parallel civilization operating just out of sight. The little people had their crafts and their territories and their rules of exchange. What the Cherokee were describing, when you strip away the word spirit, was a complete alternative economy, an older productive order that had once run this land and then withdrawn or fallen, leaving its infrastructure, the mounds and the walls and the worked stone, standing empty for the newcomers to inherit and fail to understand. That is the quiet scandal of it. Every civilization is, at bottom, a way of organizing work and wealth and knowledge across a landscape. The mounds are not decorations, they are capital. They represent staggering quantities of organized labor, planning, surplus, and command, the physical balance sheet of a society that could marshal thousands of hands toward a single purpose across generations. And the people who inherited that capital, the tribes, the Europeans, met, in many cases no longer operated it, no longer built at that scale, and in some cases no longer even claimed authorship of it. Something had come between the builders and the inheritors. Some break, some fall, some reset in which an older, larger, more productive order collapsed and a smaller world grew up in its ruins. The Cherokee remembered the break. They encoded it in the only language a pre-literate tradition has, the language of hidden peoples and immortal builders and drums in the rock. And the shortened history, the managed history, has spent a great deal of effort making sure we hear that language as make-believe. James Mooney himself is a small case study in how the record gets thin. He did the work. He got the accounts down, faithfully, in enormous detail, more than almost anyone before or since. But look at what happened to that knowledge afterward. It was published, yes, in the reports of the Bureau of Ethnology, but it was published as ethnography, as a record of quaint native belief, wrapped in the careful academic framing that told the reader in advance how to take it. These are myths. These are the charming superstitions of a vanishing people. Nothing here is to be taken as an account of anything real. The framing did the work of forgetting even as the words preserved the memory. The truth was printed and buried at the same time, buried in plain sight, which is the most effective kind of burial there is. And Mooney's own later life shows how fragile the whole enterprise was. In the 1890s, he turned his attention to the ghost dance, the great spiritual movement that swept the western tribes with its promise that the dead would return and the old world would be restored and the invaders would vanish. Mooney documented it with the same honesty he brought to everything, and in doing so he made himself politically inconvenient because he took the native side too seriously and treated their prophets as men with real grievances rather than as savages to be pacified. Later, when he worked with the Kiowa on their use of the sacred peyote, he ran directly into government officials who wanted that knowledge suppressed rather than studied, and his career suffered for it. The man who spent his life writing down what the natives actually said kept finding that the institutions around him did not want it written down. They wanted a shorter, cleaner, more convenient story. And when Mooney died in 1921, worn out and in some ways sidelined, a great deal of what he had gathered remained unpublished, in manuscript, some of it never to see print in the form he intended. Think about that. The single most careful recorder of Cherokee memory, the man who got the accounts of the Little People and the Nunahi and the older builders down on paper before they vanished, spent his final years fighting the same quiet pressure that runs all the way through this story. Pressure to keep the past small, to let the old knowledge die politely, to file the witnesses under folklore and move along. And still the accounts survive, because he wrote them down, and because you can still read them. So let us go back to them one more time, and read them the way the revisionist reads them, not as myth, but as testimony. The drumming in the rock. Set aside for a moment what you think you know, and ask what it would mean if it were literally true. A steady, rhythmic sound, coming from inside a mountain, heard by generations of sober, unimpressed mountain people who had no reason to lie and every reason not to go near it. In the Cherokee account, it is the drum of the hidden people in their townhouse inside the stone. In a revisionist account, you might ask a colder question. What is inside these mountains? What did the older civilization leave in there? The Appalachians are riddled with cave systems that have never been fully mapped. People have walked into them and never come back out. The Cherokee said there were rooms in there, and people in the rooms, and a door that only opened at certain times and only for certain people. They said it plainly, for hundreds of years, and we called it a story. The rule of silence. 7 years, or you die. Why would a myth impose that? Myths do not usually threaten to kill the person who tells them. Myths want to be told. That is how they survive. A tradition that punishes the telling of an encounter with death is not behaving like a myth. It is behaving like a security protocol. It is behaving like the memory of a real people who did not want to be found, who had made it clear to the Cherokee that discretion was the price of coexistence, and who enforced that price so consistently that the fear of it survived intact into the 1880s for Mooney to write down. The lost children who came back fed and warm, the travellers who heard a crowd inside a cliff, the town at Nikwasi saved by warriors who poured out of a mound and then withdrew back into the earth. Read as folklore, these are charming. Read as testimony, they are the persistent, specific, place-anchored reports of a hidden population that occasionally intersected with the Cherokee world and then vanished back into places, with real names, that you can still stand in front of today. And here is the part that should unsettle even the skeptic. The Cherokee had every reason, by the 1880s, to tell the government man whatever he wanted to hear, or to tell him nothing at all. They had been betrayed by the written word again and again. Treaties on paper had been used to take their land. The official record had been the instrument of their destruction, not their protection. A people in that position does not casually hand its deepest knowledge to an agent of the very government that removed them. And yet they did, to Mooney. Because something in the man persuaded them that he would write it down straight, that he would not laugh, and would not steal it, and would not twist it. They gave him the accounts of the hidden nations as a kind of trust, the last testimony of the old men, set down so that it would survive even if the tradition did not. And it did survive. That is the strange grace of the whole thing. The knowledge that the institutions wanted filed away as folklore was preserved, in full, by the honesty of the one man they had sent to collect it, and it sits there still, in print, more complete than almost any comparable record on the continent, waiting. The old men were not naive. They knew what usually happened to their words. They handed them over anyway, betting that the truth, once written down accurately, is very hard to fully kill. It can be buried, it can be mislabeled, it can be left to gather dust, but it cannot be unwritten, and so the drum in the rock is still beating on the page, if nowhere else, for anyone who cares to read what the Cherokee actually said. None of this proves anything. That has to be said plainly. There is no artifact under glass, no signed confession, no smoking gun. What there is a pattern that runs from the Appalachian rock ledges to the Irish hollow hills to the Icelandic boulders to the fish ponds of Hawaii, a pattern of older, smaller, hidden builders, a pattern of great earthworks that the current inhabitants disclaimed, a pattern of an official history that keeps the human past small and the current order permanent, and that files every inconvenient account of a greater, older, fallen world under the safe grey heading of legend. And at the centre of the American piece of that pattern sits an honest man from Indiana with a notebook, who went into the mountains to write down what a dying generation remembered, and who wrote down something far stranger than he was sent to find. And patterns are how lost history gets recovered, when it gets recovered at all. No single account ever proves a vanished world. The proof, when it comes, is always cumulative. 100 small testimonies from 100 places that should have nothing in common and yet keep describing the same thing. That is what we have here. A drum in the Appalachian rock, a pale people driven west into the dark, a wall on a Georgia mountaintop that no one will claim, immortals under the mounds, hidden builders in the Irish hills and the Icelandic stones and the Hawaiian shallows, earthworks the size of cities that the living inhabitants swore they did not raise. Take any one of them alone and you can explain it away in an afternoon. Line them all up, side by side, and the explaining away starts to feel like labour. It starts to feel like a job that someone, somewhere, is being paid to keep doing. And that, in the end, is the quiet accusation buried in everything the Cherokee told James Mooney. Not merely that the truth was lost, but that its loss was arranged and paid for and quietly kept. What the Cherokee told James Mooney about the little people of the rock ledges was not, in the end, a story about elves. It was a story about inheritance, about coming into a land that already had owners, older and greater and stranger than yourself, and learning to live carefully in the shadow of what they had left behind, and passing down, generation to generation, the memory of whose country this really was. The Cherokee never claimed the mounds. They never claimed to be first. They told the truth as they had received it, and the truth was that they were tenants in a house someone else had built, a house with rooms still occupied, rooms inside the rock, rooms under the hills, where on the right kind of night, if you were foolish enough to be out there, you could still hear the drum. The old men who told Mooney these things are long gone now. So is Mooney. The mounds are still here. Nikwasi is still here, a green hill at a crossroads, closed and silent and patient. The rock ledges are still here, and the deep caves that no one has mapped, and the fog that comes down through the laurel at dusk and turns the whole world blue and old. And the question the old men left behind is still here too, waiting in a grey government report for anyone willing to read it as something other than a fairy tale. Who was here before us? What did they build? Where did they go? And why has so much effort gone into making sure we never think to ask? The Cherokee knew the answer, or believed they did, and they told it to one honest man before the knowledge died. It is written down, it survived, and it is still, if you are willing to listen for it, coming quietly out of the rock,